My name is Emily, and before I tell you about the bracelet, before the headlines and the whispers and the unbearable lesson that honesty carves into a person's life like a river into stone, I need to tell you about the floor I was standing on when I slipped, the ground that made the fall not only possible but, in a way, predictable, because nothing starts with a single bad decision. It starts with 1,000 small hungers that collect inside you, until even a simple shine begins to look like salvation. I grew up in a small town with a 2-lane road that ran like a vein through the middle of it, carrying second-hand cars and impatient buses, and the smell of petrol to the same handful of shops whose windows promised more than our wallets could ever answer. And our house sat 3 doors behind the bakery, where the air was always warm with cinnamon in the mornings and bitter with coffee by noon. A house with paint that peeled in long, tired curls and a roof that clicked like a tired throat when the first cold rain touched it. And my father came home every evening with oil under his nails and kindness in his voice. A mechanic whose hands fixed everything except the break in the budget that widened each month. And my mother stitched the break as best she could with coupons and careful mirth, with casseroles that could feed 4 for 2 days, with quiet apologies to herself whenever she went without the bigger piece. I was the older child, the steady one, the girl who counted coins at the kitchen table after school, and the girl who made a private ritual out of wiping her shoes clean so she could walk into class looking, if not rich, at least prepared. And if you've ever been the poor girl who studies too hard and laughs a second too late because she's still translating the room, you'll know that even when nobody says a word, the difference speaks. It speaks in brand new jackets and phones with camera lenses like insect eyes, and in invitations that assume a ride you don't have and a dress you can't afford. It speaks when you learn to say, "I'm good," about things you wanted so much your chest ached. And somewhere around 16, I began to carry 2 lives. The one where I was top of my literature class, breathing words like oxygen, and the one where I stocked shelves at the grocery 3 nights a week, pricing cans of soup I could name by weight, where to hide the dents, which ones the manager would mark down on Tuesdays. And between the 2 lives there was a tightrope called hope, thin as fishing line and shining when the sun hit it. And every time I read a story that told me people could be more than the circumstances they rose from, I believed it. I believed it with the entire stubborn portion of my heart. We never starved, not exactly, because my mother could conjure dinner out of the humble arithmetic of flour and onions and 1 honest egg, and my father could bargain a spare starter, or belt out of a customer who owed him a favor. But there is a dignity that hunger dents even when it doesn't break you. The way you look away from a friend's plate at a cafe, because you counted your coins and ordered tea. The way winter becomes a season of negotiation between your body and the thermostat. The way you accept gifts like landmines, because generosity can be a mirror, and you're not always ready to see what it shows. People imagine poverty is only about money, but it is also about permission. What you're allowed to want without being called greedy. What you're allowed to dream without being called unrealistic. And as I slid from 17 into 19, the year that braided innocence and impatience into a rope I could have climbed or hung myself with, I met Isabella, yes, that Isabella, though in the beginning she was just Isa, the girl who smelled like jasmine and high notes, the girl who wore bracelets that chimed when she laughed and made eye contact when I spoke. So I felt briefly valuable. Like a coin returned to circulation, she came from money the way birds come from sky, not as a possession but as an element. And she had the kind of grace that doesn't ask forgiveness for existing. You should know that Isa was never cruel, not the easy kind of mean that rich girls are assigned in stories to comfort the rest of us. She was generous with notes, with rides after debate practice, with the kind of casual kindness that doesn't even know it is kindness. And that is its own sort of power, because it makes you want to protect the giver from the world's ugliness. And in wanting to protect, you begin to edit your own truths. And when you begin to edit your truths, you plant the first seed of a lie. The first time I visited her house, I pretended not to notice how the front door was heavy enough to close like a promise, how the walls wore art instead of calendars, how the kitchen island gleamed like an idea of a kitchen more than the place where food is wrestled into being. And Isa's mother asked me questions about my classes with a smile I longed to believe was curiosity, and not assessment. And when Isa took me to her room, God, that room, a soft storm of fabrics and mirrors and light, she let me try on a silk scarf that woke up every color in my skin. And I smiled so hard. The version of me in the mirror looked like someone I might one day meet. The thing about envy is that it rarely announces itself as such. It arrives as admiration, then realism, then a quietly negotiated exception. I would never want everything she has. Just something, but while you're bargaining with ethics in a currency of wishes, your heart is keeping a separate ledger. And in mine the entries began to crowd. A phone I couldn't replace if it broke. A pair of shoes that pinched because they were bought for price not fit. Textbooks that smelled like other people's rooms. And a college brochure on my wall like a skylight glued over concrete. At home, we were careful with joy because joy cost more. Birthdays were homemade and beautiful, but they came with the aftertaste of math. And the week that turned into the month that became the season when everything happened. Dad's hours were cut when the shop took in fewer repairs. And I saw the little tremor in his smile when he told me it was fine, that we'd tighten our belts and be all right. And Mom unrolled a wad of coupons like a magician's ribbon and said we'd play a game. Who could save the most on the list? And Ethan asked if the game came with a prize, and she said yes. The prize is us. And we laughed because that was the correct answer. But the laugh was thin, like an old sheet stretched across too many winters. I doubled my shifts. I learned to be invisible behind a register, to place friendliness like a napkin between myself and the world. And still there were nights when the quiet was so loud that I would lie awake translating it into sentences as if I could write my way out. And in that sleeplessness I discovered something dangerous. That exhaustion is a solvent. It loosens the glue that holds your better self together. It makes skipping one small rule feel like taking a breath. And yet, even then, I believed I was good. Because believing you are good is the last light we let go of. And I loved Isa, truly, for her soft attention and the way she said my name like it was lined with velvet. And when she invited me to her 20th birthday, I said yes before the question finished arriving, and then immediately thought of the dress I didn't have, and the taxi fare I couldn't spare. And she texted, "Don't worry, I'll pick you up," and I said, "You don't have to." And she said, "But I want to." And what she meant was I can, and what I heard was you cannot. And between those two translations a little crack opened. Almost nothing. Hairline. The kind that builders say is normal. Settling, nothing to worry about. But the night of the party I could feel a draft through it. A whisper. One day you will want more than the world will allow you to ask for. And when I stepped into her house, into the light that had learned how to fall in flattering ways, something inside me, maybe pride, maybe ache, took one unsteady step toward the edge I didn't yet know was there. I wish I could tell you I stumbled in an instant, that it was an accident of impulse without history, but the truth is more ordinary, and therefore more frightening. Desire is patient. It sits cross-legged in the corner of your life and watches you budget your dignity. And when the right shine appears, it stands up and says, "At last." The night of the bracelet, the evening of Isabella's 20th birthday arrived, wrapped in the kind of winter dusk that turns windows into promises and mirrors into doubts. And as I stood in front of the single cracked mirror in our hallway, I studied myself the way a critic studies a painting, cataloguing every imperfection, every threadbare patch of my one decent dress, every loose curl of hair I couldn't tame with the cheap comb I owned. And I told myself, as I had so many times before, that effort could camouflage lack, that a girl who held herself gracefully could be mistaken for someone who belonged in any room, even a room like Isa's living room, where chandeliers glimmered like captured constellations and every surface reflected a version of the world shinier than the one I lived in. Isabella arrived at my house right on time, her car humming at the curb like an obedient animal, and when I slipped into the passenger seat, she smiled and said, "You look amazing, Emily," and the words hit me like a soft hand on a bruise because even though I wanted to believe them, I knew she didn't see the frayed seams at my waist or the scuffed soles of my shoes. She saw what she wanted to see. Her friend, polished for the night, ready to orbit her world like a borrowed star. And I thanked her with a smile that hurt my cheeks, a smile stitched together from gratitude and shame. The drive to her house was quiet except for the low hum of the heater and the soft melody of a song I didn't recognize, something delicate and expensive sounding. And while Issa hummed along absent-mindedly, I stared out the window at the blur of streetlights, each one flickering past like a warning I didn't know how to read. When we arrived, I stepped out into a driveway so wide it could have held my entire neighborhood, the house looming above us like a storybook castle with its windows glowing warm and golden. Laughter and music spilled from the open front door, and as Issa took my hand to lead me inside, I felt a rush of vertigo, as if I were stepping not into a house but into a version of reality where everything was softer, brighter, easier. Inside, the party was already in full bloom. The air was rich with the smell of vanilla cake, expensive perfume, and something savory I couldn't name. Guests moved gracefully through the rooms, their clothes whispering luxury, their laughter ringing like chimes. Issa floated among them, greeting everyone with hugs and kisses, her beauty almost ethereal beneath the chandelier light. I hovered near the edges, trying to blend in, trying not to stare too long at the towering floral arrangements, or the glittering glasses lined up like jewels on the bar. Issa introduced me to a few of her cousins and friends, all of whom smiled politely before drifting away, already lost in their own conversations. I didn't mind. I was used to being the quiet one, the observer. My eyes were drawn to every detail, cataloguing textures and scents, sounds and glances, like a writer storing up words for some future page. And then I saw it. On a velvet-lined tray at the center of a polished wooden table sat a bracelet so beautiful it seemed to hum with its own light. The gold was warm and rich, coiled delicately like sunlight made solid, and tiny diamonds winked from its surface like captured stars. I had seen Issa wear jewelry before, of course, but this piece was different, rarer, more precious, a gift that was clearly meant to mark not just a birthday, but a passage into a new realm of adulthood, one where luxury was as natural as breathing. Issa saw me looking and laughed, a bright, delighted sound. "Isn't it stunning?" she said, lifting the bracelet and holding it out to me. "My parents gave it to me this morning. Here, try it on." I hesitated, my hands instinctively curling into fists at my sides. "Oh no, I couldn't," I murmured, but Issa insisted, pressing it into my palm. It was heavier than I expected, cool against my skin, and when I slid it over my wrist, a strange thrill shot through me. For one impossible moment, it felt like the world was tilting in my favor, like I was someone else, someone wealthy and admired, someone who never had to calculate every coin before making a decision. Issa clasped her hands together and said, "It looks perfect on you. See, you could be a jewelry model." I laughed nervously, but inside, her words struck deep. For those brief seconds, I believed her. I believed in this version of me. But then she took it back and set it carefully on the tray. And just like that, the illusion shattered. The weight left my wrist, but not my mind. I spent the rest of the evening half present, my smiles automatic, my laughter hollow. The bracelet became a fixed point in my vision, gleaming on the table no matter where I moved, as if it were watching me instead of the other way around. I told myself it was ridiculous to think about it, that it wasn't mine, That admiring something didn't mean I deserved it. But every time I glanced at Issa, at her laughter, her effortless grace, her life of ease, I felt a sharp ache, a hunger I didn't know how to name. As the night went on, Issa was pulled away by other guests, floating from conversation to conversation like a benevolent queen. I stayed near the corner, sipping soda and pretending to check my phone while my thoughts tangled into knots. Around me, people danced, clinked glasses, and posed for photos, their joy filling the room like a warm tide. No one paid attention to me. No one noticed when I drifted closer to the table, closer to that velvet tray and the glinting temptation it held. I told myself I was only looking, only admiring. But my pulse quickened, and my palms grew damp. It happened faster than I can explain, yet slower than a lifetime of longing. One moment I was standing there, staring down at the bracelet, and the next, my hand was moving as if it had been waiting all along. My fingers closed around the cool gold, and a jolt ran through me, half terror, half exhilaration. My ears roared with the sound of my own heartbeat. I glanced around. The guests were laughing. Issa was across the room. No one was watching. Without allowing myself to think, I slipped the bracelet into the pocket of my dress. The fabric rustled softly, a tiny whisper of betrayal. Instantly, a wave of nausea hit me. My vision blurred, and the room seemed to tilt. I wanted to scream, to throw it back on the table and run, but my legs stayed rooted. A group of Issa's friends burst into laughter nearby, and I forced my face into a neutral mask, nodding along as if nothing had happened. I told myself I would put it back later, that this wasn't real, that I was just borrowing it for a moment. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. When Issa returned, she thanked me for coming and asked if I was having fun. Her smile was so genuine, so trusting, that I almost confessed right then. My throat ached with the words, but fear sealed them inside. I smiled back, a fragile thing, and murmured, "Yes, it's perfect." The rest of the night passed in a blur of music and chatter I barely heard. Every step I took was heavy with the weight of the bracelet hidden against my hip. When the party ended, Issa hugged me tightly, her laughter ringing like bells. "Drive safe," she said, pressing a leftover cupcake into my hand. I held it carefully, terrified that my trembling fingers would betray me. On the ride home, Issa chatted about her plans for the weekend, about college applications and upcoming family trips. I nodded and made small sounds of agreement, my mind a storm of panic. When she dropped me off, I waved goodbye and stumbled inside, barely making it to my room before collapsing to my knees. My breath came in ragged gasps. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the bracelet. Under the dim glow of my bedside lamp, it gleamed like a cruel secret. For a long time, I just stared at it, my hands shaking. The thrill of possession was gone, replaced by a crushing weight of guilt. As the house slept around me, I whispered to the empty room, "What have I done?" The bracelet didn't answer. It just lay there, cold and silent, reflecting back a version of myself I didn't recognize, a girl who had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. The cracks in the mirror. The morning after the party, I woke to the thin grey light of dawn slipping through my curtains like a thief, and for a moment, before my mind fully wakened, I felt a strange and fleeting peace, that sweet, fragile moment of forgetting where you are still only half-formed, floating between dream and memory. But then my hand brushed against the fabric of my dress crumpled on the chair, and I felt the sharp edge of reality return like a slap. The bracelet was still there, hidden beneath layers of cloth, and its cold weight seemed to hum through the entire room like a secret alarm only I could hear. And I knew with a bone-deep certainty that nothing about this day would ever be normal again. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to pretend I was sick or still tired, or simply imagining the events of the night before. But the truth pressed against me like a physical thing, heavy and undeniable. I thought of Isa's laughter, her kindness, the way she had hugged me goodbye, and bile rose in my throat. I wanted to rewind time, to rip last night from existence, to return to the moment before my hand closed around that bracelet. That life doesn't come with rewinds, only consequences. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and I flinched so hard it clattered to the floor. With trembling hands, I picked it up and saw the group chat lighting up with messages, Isabella's name appearing again and again. My stomach knotted as I opened it. Bracelet missing. Please, everyone, check your bags, your cars, everything. Another message came seconds later. It's gold with small diamonds. My parents gave it to me last night. I can't find it anywhere. I'm so upset right now. The next message was from one of our mutual friends, a girl named Claire. We'll help you find it, Isa. Don't worry, maybe it just fell somewhere in the house. Isa's reply came quickly. My parents are furious. They think someone took it. They're even considering calling the police if we can't find it today. I couldn't breathe. My vision blurred as I read the words again and again, each letter slicing deeper into my chest. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, wanting to type something. I'm so sorry. I hope you find it, but I couldn't, because every letter felt like a lie. I set the phone down and buried my face in my hands, rocking slightly as a low, panicked sound escaped my throat. My mother knocked softly on the door. Emily, breakfast is ready. Are you okay, sweetheart? I jerked upright, shoving the bracelet deeper into the folds of my blanket, and forced my voice into a neutral tone. I'm fine, Mom. I'll be down in a minute. When she left, I sagged against the door. My heart beat a wild drumbeat in my ears. At breakfast, I barely touched my food. My father was reading the newspaper, his brow furrowed over some headline about rising gas prices, while my little brother Ethan chattered about a project at school. My mother kept glancing at me, her worry clear in the way she refilled my cup twice without asking. You're awfully quiet today, she said gently. I managed a weak smile. Just tired. The party went late. She seemed to accept this, but her eyes lingered on me a moment longer. I felt like a glass about to crack. As the day went on, the group chat continued to explode with messages. Isa sent updates. They had searched the entire house, every room, every drawer. The bracelet was nowhere to be found. Her parents were furious, convinced it had been stolen. One by one, my friends posted reassurances, their words a chorus of concern. One typed and deleted replies over and over, never hitting send. My guilt was a living thing now, pacing inside me, gnawing at my insides. I imagined Isa crying in her room, her parents shouting, her guests whispering. And still, the bracelet lay hidden in my drawer, wrapped in an old scarf like a dead thing I couldn't bury. 2 days passed like this. I went to work at the grocery store, stocking shelves and smiling at customers. But every can I stacked, every barcode I scanned, seemed to echo the same question. Why, Emily? Why did you do it? I barely slept, haunted by nightmares of Isa's face hurt, confused, betrayed. I began to avoid everyone. At school, I sat in the back of class, my hood pulled low, my answers clipped and quiet. Isa, usually so bright and full of energy, moved like a ghost through the halls. She smiled at me when our eyes met, a small, sad curve of her lips that pierced me like a blade. She didn't suspect me. That was the worst part. She still trusted me completely. One afternoon, I overheard 2 classmates whispering near the lockers. Did you hear about Isa's bracelet? Yeah, her parents think someone at the party stole it. Who do you think it was? There was a pause, and then the other girl said, I don't know. That Emily was near the table a lot, wasn't she? My stomach dropped. I pressed myself against the wall, holding my breath. Come on, the first girl said quickly. Emily wouldn't do that. She's not like that. But the seed of doubt had been planted. I could hear it in her tone, see it in the sideways glances I began to notice in the days that followed. That evening, Issa posted in the group chat again. My parents have decided to check the security footage from the party. They installed cameras in the living room last year. Maybe we'll see what happened. The blood drained from my face. My hands went numb. I barely made it to the bathroom before vomiting. When I looked up, my reflection in the mirror was pale and wild-eyed, a stranger's face staring back at me. I gripped the edge of the sink and whispered, "You have to confess. You have to fix this before it's too late." But fear froze me. I imagined Issa's face twisting in anger, my parents' devastation, the humiliation of everyone knowing what I had done. The thought of police involvement was a suffocating weight on my chest. That night, I couldn't stay in my room. The bracelet seemed to whisper to me from its hiding place, mocking me, reminding me of my weakness. I slipped out the back door and walked aimlessly through the dark streets, my breath fogging in the cold air. The town was quiet, windows glowing softly in the distance. I thought of all the nights Issa had probably spent like this, warm and safe in her perfect home, never knowing the kind of desperation that drove someone to steal. My anger flared briefly, hot and bitter. Why did she get to have so much while we scraped by on so little? But even as the thought formed, guilt drowned it. Issa had never been cruel to me. She had never lorded her wealth over me. She had been my friend. My betrayal felt even sharper because of her kindness. When I returned home, my mother was waiting at the kitchen table, her face etched with worry. "Emily, where have you been? It's nearly midnight." I just needed some air," I said, my voice hoarse. She reached across the table and took my hands. "Sweetheart, you're scaring me. You've been so distant lately. If something is wrong, you can tell me." Tears burned my eyes, but I forced a smile. "I'm fine, Mom. Really." She didn't look convinced, but she let it go. The next morning, Issa asked to speak with me privately after class. My heart pounded as I followed her into an empty hallway. She turned to face me, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. "Emily," she said softly, "my parents checked the cameras. They didn't see anyone take the bracelet clearly, but they saw you near the table a lot that night." My breath caught. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. Issa reached out and touched my arm. "Please," she whispered. "I just need to hear it from you. Did you take it?" The world seemed to tilt beneath me. Her trust was a fragile thing, balanced on the edge of my next word. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. My heart screamed, "Tell her the truth." But my fear screamed louder. The silence stretched between us like a chasm, and I saw her eyes fill with tears. Finally, I forced a weak smile and shook my head. "No, Issa. Of course not." Her shoulders sagged, a mix of relief and lingering doubt. "I believe you," she said softly. I needed to ask." When she walked away, my knees buckled. I sank against the wall, shaking violently. I had crossed another line, deeper than before. Not only had I stolen from my friend, but now I had lied to her face. The guilt was suffocating. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the bracelet hidden in the drawer like a ticking bomb. My phone buzzed beside me. A new message from Issa. "Emily, thank you for being there for me through this. I don't know what I'd do without you." The tears came then, unstoppable and wrenching. I buried my face in the pillow and sobbed until my throat was raw. I wanted to scream the truth into the darkness, to tear the lie out of me like a poisoned thorn. But I stayed silent, trapped in a cage of my own making, knowing that every second I waited made the eventual explosion inevitable.